They taught me that confession cleanses the soul, that speaking one's sins brings absolution and peace. I was a priest of the Ecclesiarchy, trained in the sacred duty of hearing mankind's darkest secrets. Then they assigned me to a black ship, and I learned the truth. Some confessions should never be spoken aloud, and some sins cannot be absolved, only contained. I am Father Matthias Kael, and I have heard things that should have remained silent. My name was Father Matthias Kael, confessor of the Adeptus Ministorum, servant of the God Emperor of mankind. For 20 years I ministered in the Cathedral of St. Drusus on the shrine world of Ophelia 7, and in those 2 decades I heard the confessions of perhaps 50,000 souls, pilgrims who had traveled across the segmentum to prostrate themselves before the saints' remains. Nobility seeking absolution for the compromises required to maintain their power. Common faithful burdened by the small cruelties and moral failures that accumulate across a lifetime of survival in the Imperium. I was good at my calling, not through any particular charisma or theological brilliance, but through patience and genuine care for the suffering of those who came before me. The confessional booth in the Cathedral of St. Drusus was ancient, carved from blackwood imported from a world whose name had been lost to time. The screen between penitent and confessor was wrought silver, inscribed with prayers of protection and discretion. When someone knelt on the other side and began to speak, I listened with my entire being. This is what they trained us for at the Schola Progenium. The art of listening without judgment, the discipline of hearing humanity's darkness without allowing it to corrupt your own soul. The theology of absolution. Understanding that the Emperor's mercy is infinite, even when our comprehension of it is limited. Every confession followed a pattern: the initial hesitation, the gradual unburdening, the moment of vulnerability when the sin is finally named, and then the relief that comes with speaking darkness into light. I believed in the power of this ritual absolutely. Confession was not merely psychological comfort, though it provided that. It was a spiritual act with real metaphysical weight. The Imperium teaches us that humanity possesses immortal souls, that these souls are the Emperor's currency, and that maintaining their purity is essential to his grand design. When a penitent confessed their sins to me and received absolution, I was facilitating a genuine transaction between mortal and divine. Their burden was lifted, their soul was cleansed, if only temporarily. The cycle could begin again. My typical day began before dawn with my own prayers and devotions. Then, I would take my place in the confessional and remain there until sunset, with only brief breaks for sustenance. Some days I heard 3 confessions, some days I heard 30. Each was unique in its details but familiar in its essential shape. Humanity's capacity for sin is vast, but the categories are surprisingly limited. Pride, greed, lust, wrath, envy. The ancient classifications still held true 10,000 years after they were first codified on Old Terra. The worst confessions were not those involving dramatic evil. I rarely heard from murderers or heretics. Such individuals did not typically seek absolution. The worst were the quiet compromises, the accumulated weight of small moral failures. The factory overseer who looked away when workers died from preventable accidents because stopping production would anger his superiors. The mother who could not bring herself to love a child born with mutations, who prayed nightly for the emperor to take the infant away. The guard veteran who survived battles by using his comrades as shields, who lived while better men died. These confessions haunted me because they revealed the impossible calculus of survival in the Imperium. How do you maintain moral purity in a system designed to extract every possible resource from its population? How do you remain human when humanity itself has become a commodity measured in labor output and military utility? I did not have answers. Only the ritual of absolution and the hope that the Emperor's mercy was indeed infinite. The summons came in the month of my 20th year of service. An astropathic message transmitted directly to Cardinal Vasilis, the ranking Ecclesiarchy official for the subsector. requesting a confessor of proven faith and psychological resilience for special assignment. The cardinal summoned me to his chambers in the cathedral's highest spire, a journey I had made perhaps 5 times in 2 decades. When a cardinal summons you personally, it is either a great honor or a terrible omen. Cardinal Vassilis was ancient, his body sustained by Juvenat treatments and augmetic implants that clicked and whirred with each movement. His face was more scar tissue than skin, the result of a flagellant period in his youth when he had mortified his flesh in penance for sins he never specified. He regarded me with eyes that had witnessed 3 centuries of the Imperium's grinding brutality. "Father Kael," he began without preamble, "you have been selected for assignment to the League of Black Ships. You will serve as confessor aboard a vessel transporting psychers to Terra for evaluation and processing." The honor should have overwhelmed me. The League of Black Ships was one of the most vital organizations in the Imperium, responsible for collecting and transporting individuals cursed with psychic ability. Without the Black Ships, untrained psychers would remain scattered across the galaxy, each one a potential doorway for demonic incursion. The work was essential, dangerous, and spiritually significant. To be chosen as confessor for such a vessel suggested that my 2 decades of service had been noticed and valued. Yet something in the cardinal's tone suggested this was not entirely a blessing. "Your Eminence," I replied carefully, "I am honored by this assignment. May I ask why I was selected?" The cardinal's expression did not change. "You have demonstrated an unusual capacity for bearing others' burdens without allowing them to corrupt you. You have heard confessions that would drive lesser priests to despair or heresy, yet you remain faithful. This resilience will be necessary for what awaits you. The psychers require spiritual ministration during their transport. They require many things, Father Kael. Most will not survive the journey to Terra, and even fewer will survive the soul-binding process. Your duty is to provide whatever comfort the Ecclesiarchy can offer during their final days of freedom, if freedom is what we can call their existence. You will hear their confessions. You will offer what absolution you can. You will bear witness to their suffering in the Emperor's name." There was something in how he said, "bear witness," that made me uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was my calling. If the Emperor required me to minister to his most cursed servants, who was I to question? I departed Ophelia 7 3 weeks later, after brief preparations and blessings from the cathedral's senior clergy. My personal effects fit in a single trunk: ecclesiastical robes, prayer books, devotional icons, and the small wooden prayer beads I had carried since my days at the Schola Progenium. I wore the black cassock of a traveling confessor, marked with the skull and book symbol of the Ministorum. At my throat hung an Aquila pendant blessed by St. Drusus himself, or so the cathedral's tradition claimed. The transport to the rendezvous point took 11 days through the warp, during which I occupied myself with prayer and study. I reviewed texts on ministering to the condemned, on providing spiritual comfort to those facing certain death, on maintaining one's own faith in the face of overwhelming suffering. The texts were abstract, theoretical, written by theologians who had never actually performed the duties they described. Still, they provided a framework, a sense of what I might expect. When we translated back into real space, the Black Ship was waiting. The vessel designated Misericordia Ultima, or Final Mercy in Low Gothic, hung against the void like a cathedral carved from night itself. It was massive, easily 3 kilometers from prow to stern, its hull black as the space surrounding it. Every surface bristled with weapon batteries, lance turrets, and the distinctive hexagrammic wards used to contain psychic energy. At the stern, massive engines glowed with barely contained plasma. This was not merely a transport vessel. It was a prison, a fortress, and a tomb. My shuttle approached through a maze of defensive emplacements and psychic suppression fields that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. Even I, possessing no psychic talent whatsoever, could feel the weight of the ship's containment systems. What must it be like for those with the witch sight, trapped within such a vessel? The docking bay was cavernous and cold, lit by harsh lumens that created deep shadows in every corner. A reception party awaited, the ship's captain, several armored security personnel, and a figure that made my breath catch in my throat. She stood perfectly still, clad in the black bodysuit and ornate armor of the Sisters of Silence. Her face was uncovered, revealing features that would have been beautiful if not for the absolute emptiness in her eyes. She was a blank, a null, a psychic void in human form. Captain Horvath was a career Navy officer, his uniform crisp despite obvious signs of decades of service. His augmetic left eye whirred softly as it focused on me, scanning and recording. "Father Kael," he said, his voice professionally neutral. "Welcome aboard the Misericordia Ultima. I am Captain Horvath. This is Sister Octavia of the Silent Sisterhood, who will serve as your liaison and protection during your time aboard." Sister Octavia did not speak. The Sisters of Silence took a vow that went beyond mere silence, something spiritual and binding, but she inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. Standing near her felt wrong in a way I struggled to articulate. Not threatening, exactly, but fundamentally uncomfortable, like standing at the edge of a great height. "Your quarters have been prepared," Captain Horvath continued. "They are located in Section 12, near the primary penitent holds. Sister Octavia will escort you. You will report to me each week for status updates on your progress. The ship's liturgical schedule has been provided to your data slate. Do you have questions?" I had hundreds, but the captain's demeanor suggested he would not welcome them. "No, Captain. I am ready to begin my duties." "Then the Emperor protects, Father. You will need his protection here." Sister Octavia led me through corridors that seemed designed to disorient and oppress. The Misericordia Ultima was not built for comfort or aesthetic pleasure. Every surface was adamantium or reinforced ceramite, inscribed with hexagrammic wards and purity seals that dated back centuries. The lighting was deliberately harsh, creating sharp contrasts between illumination and shadow. The air tasted recycled, filtered through sanctification systems that left a faint metallic tang on the tongue. We descended through the ship's levels via massive freight elevators designed to move heavy cargo rather than personnel. Sister Octavia stood perfectly still during the descent, her presence a void in my peripheral awareness. I found myself unable to look directly at her for more than a few seconds. My eyes would slide away as if repelled by some force I could not name. This, I realized, was what it meant to be near a blank. She was not merely silent. She was an absence, a hole in reality where a person should be. The primary penitent holds occupied levels 7 through 13 of the ship. My quarters were on level 12, positioned deliberately between the administrative sections above and the containment areas below. The chamber was small but functional. A cot bolted to the wall, a small desk with a data slate, a shrine to the Emperor consisting of a simple aquila mounted above a devotional candle, and a washing station. The walls were bare metal inscribed with prayers of protection. A single viewport, barely larger than my hand, showed the infinite darkness of the void beyond. Sister Octavia gestured to a case on the desk, then to a Vox unit mounted beside the door. Her meaning was clear enough. The case contained materials I would need, and the Vox would summon her if necessary. She placed her hand over her heart in the sign of the Aquila, then departed without a sound. I was alone in a way I had not been alone since entering service to the Ecclesiarchy. The cathedral on Ophelia 7 had always hummed with life, with the presence of thousands of faithful souls. Here, the silence was absolute and oppressive. I opened the case. Inside were fresh vestments, a portable confessional screen that could be assembled in various configurations, a lumen lantern blessed by the Adeptus Ministorum, and a thick manual titled Protocols for Spiritual Ministration to Psyker Cargo. The clinical language was jarring, not penitents or faithful, but cargo. I suppose from the ship's perspective, that was accurate. These were not passengers. They were prisoners, being transported to Terra for processing, one way or another. The manual was comprehensive and horrifying in its bureaucratic precision. It outlined procedures for conducting confessions in psychically suppressed environments, for maintaining spiritual discipline when exposed to warp corruption, for recognizing signs of demonic taint in both penitents and oneself. There were strict protocols about what could and could not be promised to psychers. I was forbidden from suggesting they might be released, from offering hope of anything beyond serving the Emperor in whatever capacity the administratum deemed appropriate, from implying their suffering had been undeserved or unjust. An entire section dealt with containment breach scenarios, what I should do if a psyker manifested their abilities violently during confession. The answer was simple and absolute. Activate the emergency vox, evacuate immediately, and allow the Sisters of Silence and security teams to handle the situation with extreme prejudice. Under no circumstances was I to attempt intervention, reasoning, or continued spiritual counsel during an active manifestation. My life was considered less valuable than preventing potential warp breach. I spent my first night aboard unable to sleep, listening to sounds that filtered through the bulkheads. Distant mechanical humming, the occasional clang of metal on metal, and underneath it all, a sound that might have been wind or breath or thousands of voices whispering just below the threshold of hearing. I told myself it was the ship's systems, the ventilation and processing equipment that kept the massive vessel functioning. But sleep did not come easily. Morning arrived by chronometer rather than dawn. In the void, there was no sun to mark the passage of time. I performed my devotions, dressed in fresh vestments, and activated the vox to signal my readiness to begin duties. Sister Octavia arrived within minutes, as if she had been waiting just outside. Today, she would provide what the manual called orientation to cargo conditions. We descended to level 9, the uppermost of the containment areas. The change in atmosphere was immediate and visceral. The temperature dropped by at least 10 degrees. The hexagrammic wards became more frequent and more elaborate, covering every surface in overlapping patterns of protection. And the sound I had heard during the night grew louder, resolving into what it actually was. Human voices, thousands of them, speaking, crying, praying, screaming in a constant low roar that the ship's systems could not entirely suppress. The first holding area contained children. Boys and girls ranging from perhaps 8 years old to adolescents, confined in cells that held 4 to 6 individuals each. The cells were clean but minimal. Bunks, a sanitation unit, and nothing else. The children wore identical gray shifts marked with identification numbers. Some sat in silence, staring at nothing. Others wept quietly. A few pressed against the reinforced glass of their cell doors, watching us pass with expressions of desperate hope. Sister Octavia stopped before one cell and gestured for me to observe. Inside were 5 children of various ages. The youngest, a girl with dark hair, sat cross-legged in the center of the floor, rocking back and forth while humming a tune that set my teeth on edge. The melody was wrong in a way I could not articulate, its intervals and progressions somehow inverted. The other children in the cell stayed as far from her as possible, pressed against the walls. A data slate mounted beside the cell provided minimal information. The girl's designation was Penitent 773 Ilara. Age, 11 standard years. Origin, Agri-World Pelion 4. Manifestation event, psychokinetic surge during Harvest Festival, resulting in 17 casualties, including immediate family. Threat assessment, moderate. Prognosis, suitable for potential sanctioning if psychological stability can be maintained during transport. 17 casualties. 17 people dead because a child could not control abilities she did not ask for and could not understand. And now that child sat in a cell, humming an unnatural melody. being transported to Terra, where she would either be soul-bound to the Emperor's service or consumed as fuel for the Astronomicon. There was no third option. No path that led to freedom or normal life. She was 11 years old, and her fate was already sealed. Sister Octavia moved on, leading me through corridor after corridor of cells. Each held psychers in various states of physical and mental coherence. The cells were organized by threat level and age, with the youngest and least dangerous on level 9, progressing downward to increasingly secure containment. We passed cells holding adolescents who stared with eyes that reflected light in unsettling ways. Adults who muttered constantly in languages that were not Low Gothic or any recognizable human tongue. Elderly psychers whose skin had taken on strange textures or colors from decades of suppressing their abilities before finally being discovered. The middle levels, 10 and 11, held those who had been in custody longer or whose manifestations had been more violent. Here, the cells were smaller, more heavily reinforced, with additional suppression fields that created visible distortions in the air. The inhabitants showed clear signs of deterioration. Many had lost significant weight despite adequate nutrition. Their hair often fell out in patches. Their skin developed lesions or unusual pigmentation. Some appeared to be aging rapidly, their bodies unable to sustain themselves under constant psychic suppression. One cell held a man who might have been 30 or might have been 60. It was impossible to tell. He sat perfectly still on his bunk, hands folded in his lap, staring at the wall. According to his data slate, he was Penitent 429 Goran, a former Imperial Guardsman who had begun manifesting during his third combat deployment. He had served with honor for 8 years before the curse revealed itself. Now he waited to be delivered to Terra, his service to the Imperium continuing in a different and more terrible form. Sister Octavia stopped before a particular cell on level 11 and gestured emphatically for my attention. Inside was an adolescent boy, perhaps 15 years old, who stood at the center of his cell, speaking in a constant, rapid stream. His voice was too low for me to make out words, but the cadence was wrong, shifting between different rhythms and tones, as if multiple people were speaking through the same mouth. His designation was Penitent 681 Davos. Manifestation, uncontrolled precognition, and possible warp communion. Threat assessment, high. Prognosis, unlikely to survive transport. As I watched, the boy's head snapped toward me with unnatural speed. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment his voice became clear. The listener comes. The one who hears all. He comes down to the depths where the shadows speak with borrowed tongues. Then his gaze slid away, and he returned to his incomprehensible muttering. Sister Octavia touched my arm, the first physical contact she had initiated. Even through my vestments, her touch felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She gestured firmly toward the elevator. We were not stopping here. Not yet. But I understood the warning. The boy had spoken to me directly, had perceived my presence despite the psychic suppression fields. Some of the cargo was more aware than others. We descended to level 12, where my quarters were located. Here, the ship transitioned from pure containment to mixed function. There were crew quarters, maintenance stations, and at the far end of a long corridor, a small chapel that had been consecrated for my use. It was a modest space, perhaps 10 meters square, with simple wooden pews that could seat 20. At the front stood an altar of black stone, behind which hung an aquila wrought in bronze. To the left of the altar, a confessional had been constructed, a permanent fixture with reinforced walls, and the portable screen I had been provided incorporated into its design. The confessional was surrounded by additional hexagrammic wards and equipped with an emergency Vox system. Outside the booth, positions had been marked where guards would stand during confession sessions. Nothing was left to chance. Every element of the chapel's design acknowledged the reality that we were not dealing with ordinary penitents, but with individuals whose very thoughts could tear reality apart. Sister Octavia gestured to the chapel, then to me, then to the data slate she carried. The meaning was clear. This was my domain, my workspace, where I would conduct the spiritual ministry that was my purpose aboard this vessel. She typed rapidly on the slate and turned it to show me. Confessions begin tomorrow. Captain will send candidates. I will always be present. If I signal, you evacuate immediately. No exceptions. I nodded my understanding. She departed without ceremony, leaving me alone in the chapel. I spent the next hour consecrating the space properly, performing the rites of sanctification, lighting devotional candles, arranging my prayer books and devotional items on the altar. The work was familiar, comforting in its routine. This I knew how to do. This was the foundation of my service. That evening, I was summoned to meet with the ship's senior staff. The conference chamber was on level 5, in the administrative section far above the cargo holds. Present were Captain Horvath, Sister Octavia, the ship's master-at-arms, the chief medicae. A wizened man in ecclesiastical robes, even older and more worn than my own. Father Kael, Captain Horvath began. This is Father Demetrius. He has served aboard black ships for 11 years across 5 voyages. He will brief you on practical considerations for your ministry. Father Demetrius looked ancient, his face a landscape of wrinkles and age spots. His hands trembled with a palsy that seemed neurological rather than merely age-related. His eyes, though, were sharp and disturbingly intense. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience that went far beyond his apparent years. "You are young," he said without preamble. "You have ministered to normal humans, to faithful souls who confess understandable sins and seek reasonable absolution. That experience will not prepare you for what awaits in the holds." "I am prepared to adapt my methods as necessary," I replied, trying to keep defensiveness from my tone. "Adaptation will not save you, boy. Understanding might." He leaned forward, those intense eyes boring into mine. "The psychers you will hear are not merely sinners. They are conduits, doorways. Every moment of their existence, they touch the warp, and the warp touches back. When they confess to you, you are not hearing their sins alone. You are hearing echoes of things that have whispered to them, shown themselves to them, promised them power or knowledge or relief from suffering. Do you understand? Their confessions are contaminated." The word hung in the air like a curse. Contaminated. Not metaphorically or theologically, but literally. These confessions carried psychic weight, warp taint, the residue of contact with entities that should not exist in rational space. "Then how am I to minister to them?" I asked. "If their very words are dangerous, how can I fulfill my duty?" Father Demetrius smiled, and it was one of the saddest expressions I had ever witnessed. "Very carefully, Father Kael. Very carefully indeed. Not all confessions are meant to be heard, and not all souls can be saved by absolution. Sometimes, the kindest thing we can offer is simply witness, acknowledgement that their suffering exists, even if we cannot end it." He stood with difficulty, leaning heavily on a walking stick I had not noticed before. "I will leave you with one final piece of advice. If you begin to hear voices when you are alone, if you start to experience memories that are not your own, if you see things that should not be there, report it immediately. The warp is insidious. It does not announce itself with fire and horns. It seeps in through cracks in your certainty, through moments of doubt or compassion. Stay vigilant, or you will become one of the cargo yourself." With that blessing, such as it was, my orientation was complete. The first penitent arrived at the chapel the following morning, escorted by 2 armed guards and Sister Octavia. The guards were not ceremonial. They carried shock mauls and hell guns, weapons designed to incapacitate or kill instantly. Their armor bore hexagrammic wards similar to those covering the ship's walls, and their helmets included psychic dampening circuitry that created a faint distortion in the air around their heads. They took their positions, flanking the confessional booth with practiced efficiency, weapons held at low ready. Sister Octavia stood nearest the confessional entrance, her null presence creating a bubble of psychic silence that I could feel, even without possessing any warp-touched abilities. The penitent, a young girl whose gray shift bore the designation 773 Alara, stood between the guards, small and fragile and utterly terrified. She was the child I had observed on level 9, the one who had killed 17 people during a harvest festival on some agri-world whose name I had already forgotten. 11 years old. Her dark hair had been cut short, and her face bore the gauntness of inadequate sleep and constant stress. I stood from where I had been kneeling in prayer before the altar and approached slowly, keeping my movements gentle and unthreatening. Her eyes tracked me with the wariness of a prey animal. "Peace, child," I said softly. "I am Father Matthias Kael, confessor of the Adeptus Ministorum. I am here to listen, if you wish to speak." She said nothing, but her eyes darted to the confessional booth, then back to me. She understood the purpose of this summons, even if she did not understand why it should matter. What was the point of confession when your fate was already determined, when no amount of absolution would change what awaited you on Terra? I gestured to the booth. "The confessional is a sacred space. What you say within it is between you, me, and the God Emperor. These guards are here for everyone's protection, but they will not repeat what they hear. This, I promise you." After a long moment, she moved toward the booth. I followed, taking my place on the confessor's side of the screen, while she knelt on the penitent's side. Through the wrought silver screen, her face was distorted into fragments, but I could see enough. She clasped her small hands together tightly, knuckles white with tension. The traditional opening came automatically to my lips. "In the name of the God Emperor of mankind, speak your sins that they may be witnessed and judged, that your soul may find peace in his eternal light." Silence stretched between us. I waited. Patience was the first tool of any confessor. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "I killed my mother." The words were simple, declarative, carrying a weight that threatened to crush the small body from which they emerged. I said nothing, allowing space for her to continue. This was the fundamental art of confession, creating silence that demanded to be filled. "It was the Harvest Day festival," she continued, her voice gaining strength through the telling. "Everyone in the commune came together. There was music and dancing and food. Real food, Father, not just the nutri-paste we usually ate. Meat from the livestock, vegetables from the premium gardens, even sweet cakes. My mother was so happy. She was laughing, dancing with my father, and I thought," her voice cracked. She paused, and I could hear her breathing becoming irregular, the precursor to tears. Then, the older boys started teasing me. They said I was too small, too weak, that I would never be chosen for the processor guilds like they would. They pushed me, and I fell into the mud, and everyone laughed. I felt something inside me, Father. Like a fire, but not a fire. Like pressure building behind my eyes, in my chest, everywhere. I tried to hold it in. I tried so hard. "What happened then, child?" I asked gently, though the report I had read already told me the answer. It burst out. I did not mean it to. I did not even know what it was. There was light, Father, so much light, and it came from me, from my hands and my eyes and my mouth, and everything around me. She was sobbing now, words tumbling out between gasps. The festival pavilion exploded. People were thrown through the air like dolls. I heard screaming and saw fire and smelled burning, and my mother was closest to me. She took the worst of it. I saw her body. Father, I saw what I did to her. Through the screen, I watched her small frame shake with anguish. This was genuine remorse, uncomplicated by rationalization or self-justification. She had killed her mother and 16 others through an accident of biology she did not understand and could not control. What absolution could possibly address such a horror? What words could provide comfort? Elera, I said, using her name, though protocol suggested I should maintain emotional distance. You did not choose to be born with this curse. You did not will the deaths that occurred. The sin, if we can even call it that, lies not with you but with the nature of the universe itself. But they are still dead because of me, she whispered. My mother is still dead. I still killed her. Yes, I said. Because there was no point in lying, and you will carry that knowledge for whatever time remains to you. But hear me, child. The Emperor in his wisdom allows nothing without purpose. Your abilities, terrible as they are, will serve him. On Terra, you will be trained or bound or transformed into a tool of his will. Your suffering has meaning within his design, even if we cannot fully comprehend it. Will it hurt? She asked. The binding, I mean. Will it hurt? I wanted to lie. Every instinct of compassion wanted to tell her it would be painless, that she would simply fall asleep and wake transformed. But Father Demetrius's words echoed in my mind. Not all souls can be saved by absolution. Sometimes, the kindest thing we can offer is witness, and witness required truth. Yes, I said quietly, it will hurt. The accounts describe it as the worst pain imaginable, but it is brief, and afterward, if you survive it, you will serve the Emperor directly. You will be his tool, his servant, bound to him in a way that transcends normal human existence. She was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, taking on a quality of acceptance that seemed far too mature for her years. Then I will endure it. For my mother, for everyone I killed, I will endure whatever comes. For that resolve, child, you have my blessing. In the name of the Emperor, your sins are witnessed and your burden acknowledged. May his light guide you through the darkness that awaits. The confession ended. Guards escorted her back to her cell. Sister Octavia remained behind, watching me with those empty eyes. I realized I was trembling slightly, adrenaline coursing through me, though nothing violent had occurred. I had just condemned a child to torture with honest words. Was that ministry? Was that spiritual comfort? I did not know. The second confession came that afternoon. Penitent 429 Goran, the former guardsman I had observed on level 11. He was a different creature entirely from young Elara. Where she had been fragile and broken, he was rigid with military discipline, barely containing profound psychological damage. He wore his gray shift like a uniform, and when he sat in the confessional booth, his posture was textbook parade rest, despite having no parade ground to stand upon. State your sins, soldier, I said, adapting my approach to match his bearing. Sir, Guardsman 2nd Class Goran Mathis, formerly of the Cadian 214th Infantry Regiment, seconded to the Astra Militarum Expeditionary Force Delta 79er. I hereby confess to crimes against the Emperor and the Imperium committed under influence of warp-spawned corruption during deployment to contested world Hadrian's Gate. His voice was mechanical, reciting a prepared statement. I needed to move past the military facade to reach the human beneath. Goran, I said, using his name. You are not on trial here. This is confession, not court-martial. Speak to me as a man speaks to one who would understand his burden. Something in his rigid posture cracked slightly. Father, I do not know where the orders ended and the voices began. During the final assault on the heretic fortress, we fought through corridors filled with things that should not exist. Daemons, the commissars called them afterward, though during the battle we had no words for what we faced. I saw brothers torn apart by claws that emerged from shadows. I heard screaming that came from inside my own skull. He paused, and I heard him struggle for breath. That is when I began to hear the voice. It sounded like my squad sergeant at first, giving tactical commands. Move left, suppress that position, advance on my mark. I followed the commands because that is what you do in combat. You follow orders without question. But Father, his voice dropped to a horrified whisper. The sergeant had died 3 rooms back. I had seen his body, and the commands the voice gave me, they were wrong. They sent me toward civilians the heretics had imprisoned, told me they were enemy combatants. Made you what, Goran? Made me execute them. Made me kill 14 unarmed prisoners because the voice said they were threats. I pulled the trigger. Father, I watched them die, and only afterward, when the voice went silent, did I realize what I had done. The commissariat investigated. They determined I had been compromised by warp influence during combat. They could have executed me for heresy. But instead, they handed me to the black ships. Said I had potential value, that I manifested minor precognitive abilities useful for military purposes, if properly sanctioned. The horror of his situation crystallized before me. He had been a loyal soldier driven to commit atrocities by forces he could neither understand nor resist. And now he was being rewarded for that trauma by being transformed into a weapon. His psychic ability had manifested through the worst experience of his life, and that manifestation was being deemed useful enough to preserve. Goran, you acted under compulsion. The theological consensus is clear. Sins committed under demonic influence carry reduced culpability. You are not damned for what the warp forced you to do. But I still did it, Father. I still see their faces. 14 people, civilians. I executed them because a voice in my head told me to, and I was too broken to question whether the voice was real. There was no absolution that could address this, no prayer that could erase those 14 deaths or remove them from his memory. All I could offer was acknowledgement. Your sin is witnessed, Goran. Your burden is seen. The Emperor knows what you carry, and if there is justice in his design, he will grant you opportunity to balance those deaths with service. That is all any of us can hope for. He sat in silence for a moment, then rose. Thank you, Father, for listening, if nothing else. The guards escorted him away, and I was left alone with the weight of his confession, settling over me like ash. The third confession came after evening prayers. The subject was younger than Goran, but older than Alara, perhaps 16 or 17 standard years. His designation was 681 Davos. The boy I had seen muttering on level 11, the one who had spoken directly to me about the listener. The guards who brought him seemed more tense than usual, and Sister Octavia positioned herself directly beside the confessional entrance rather than her usual position several meters away. The boy sat in the booth, and immediately I knew something was different. The air pressure seemed to shift. My ears popped as if experiencing rapid altitude change. Through the screen, I could see his face, and his eyes were wrong. The pupils dilated and contracted arrhythmically, independent of the light level. And the irises seemed to shift color between brown and green and something that was neither. In the name of the God Emperor, I began, but he interrupted me. The listener comes to hear, he said, but it was not one voice. It was several voices speaking in unison, each slightly out of sync with the others, creating an echo effect that made my head ache. The confessor seeks to absolve, but there are sins beyond absolution, truths beyond doctrine, knowledge beyond faith. Davos, I said firmly, trying to anchor him to his identity. You are in the presence of the Emperor's servant. Speak your confession or remain silent, but speak with your own voice. his head tilted at an angle no human neck should comfortably achieve. Which voice is my own? Father, the one I was born with, the one I learned when the warp opened before me, the ones that whisper truths the Imperium hides. I have so many voices now. They speak of what was, what is, what may be, what should never be. The temperature in the confessional seemed to drop. I could see my breath misting in the air. This was wrong. This was exactly what the protocols warned against. But I had not been given permission to abort the confession, and the guards had not signaled emergency evacuation. Perhaps this was within acceptable parameters for a high-threat penitent. Then tell me, I said, maintaining the ritual framework even as unease crawled up my spine. They say you are afraid, Father Matthias Kael of Ophelia 7, ordained at age 23. 20 years in service to the Cathedral of St. Drusus. They say you doubt whether your calling is genuine or merely comfortable routine. They say you wonder if the Emperor truly listens to prayers, or if the faithful speak into empty void, hoping echo will sound like response. My blood went cold. Those were my doubts, my secret questions. Things I had confessed to no one because to voice them would be to court accusations of heresy. How could this boy know them? Psychic resonance. The rational part of my mind insisted. He was pulling information from my surface thoughts, reading me the way an astropath reads distant minds. This was a known phenomenon, documented in the protocols. But it felt more intimate than that. It felt like violation. They also say, the boy continued, his multiple voices rising and falling in unsettling harmonies, that you made a choice once. A young man came to you in the cathedral, confessed to crimes against his family, sought guidance. You could have reported him to the Arbites, had him arrested and punished according to imperial law. Instead, you gave absolution and sent him away believing himself forgiven. 3 weeks later, he killed again. 5 people died because you chose mercy over justice. You never told anyone. You carry that weight still. The confession booth seemed to be closing in around me. He was describing an event from 12 years ago. A decision I had agonized over and ultimately made in accordance with Ecclesiarchy teachings about forgiveness and redemption. The man had seemed genuinely repentant, truly committed to changing his ways. I could not have known he would relapse, could not have predicted the violence that would follow. But 5 people were dead, and I had contributed to their deaths by allowing their killer to walk free after his confession. Stop, I said, my voice cracking slightly. This is not confession. This is truth, Father. Raw and unfiltered. I see you because the warp has opened my eyes to sight beyond sight. I know you because in touching the immaterium, I touch all minds it touches. And you, confessor, you are touched by it whether you know this or not. Every sin you hear, every darkness you witness, it marks you, leaves residue, and something in the warp pays attention to those who accumulate such marks. His eyes, all 3 of them now, because a 3rd eye had opened in the center of his forehead, weeping blood, and something that glowed with faint bioluminescence fixed on me with terrible clarity. The listener is coming, Father. It knows you now. It will feed on everything you hear, every confession you witness. You are the doorway, and it will use you to... Sister Octavia moved with speed that defied human limits. She was inside the confessional booth, her hand pressed against the boy's forehead, and he convulsed violently. The multiple voices screamed in unison, a sound that made the chapel's bronze aquila vibrate sympathetically. Then silence. The boy slumped forward, unconscious or dead, I could not tell which. The 3rd eye had vanished, leaving only a bloody mark on his forehead. The guards rushed forward, extracting his limp body and carrying him away with practiced efficiency. Sister Octavia turned to me, her blank face showing no emotion, but I could see something in her stance. Concern, perhaps. Or warning. She pulled out her data slate and typed rapidly, "You are unharmed." I nodded, though I was not certain it was true. My hands trembled, my heart raced, and in the back of my mind, where there should have been only my own thoughts, I heard something that might have been whispering, or might have been the echo of the boy's multiple voices, or might have been something else entirely. Sister Octavia typed again. Report to Medicae for examination. Standard protocol after high-threat confession. Report to Medicae. What happened to him? I asked, finding my voice at last. She considered for a moment, then typed, Warp breach. Minor. My presence suppressed it. He will be sedated and placed in maximum containment. You should not see him again. He knew things, I said. Things he could not have known. Things I never told anyone. Her response was simple and chilling. The warp knows all secrets. That is why it is dangerous. She escorted me to the Medicae Bay, where I was subjected to an hour of examinations designed to detect warp taint. Blood samples, psychic resonance scans, theological questioning designed to identify heretical thought patterns. The Medicae, a tired-looking woman with augmetic eyes, eventually declared me uncontaminated, but recommended I take suppressant medication as a precaution. I refused. I would not dull my mind with drugs, would not compromise my spiritual clarity. That night, alone in my quarters, I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the boy's third eye opening, weeping blood and light. I heard his multiple voices speaking truths I had never voiced. And underneath it all, barely audible, I heard something else, a sound like breathing, like patient, attentive listening. Father Demetrius had warned me. Not all confessions are meant to be heard, but I had not understood what he meant. Not truly. Now, lying in my bunk aboard the Misericordia Ultima, surrounded by thousands of psychers whose very existence created ripples in reality, I began to comprehend. Every confession I heard aboard this ship carried psychic weight. Every sin spoken aloud resonated in the warp, and something, somewhere in that realm of chaos and hunger, was paying attention to the man who listened to sins. The listener comes, the boy had said. It knows you now. I prayed until dawn, seeking comfort in familiar litanies, but the words felt hollow in a way they never had before, and the shadows in my quarters seemed deeper than any absence of light could justify. The request came on my 8th day aboard the Misericordia Ultima. Captain Horvath summoned me to his quarters, a Spartan chamber that differed from my own only in the presence of tactical displays and navigational charts covering one wall. He stood before a hololithic projection of the ship's interior, the lower containment levels highlighted in angry red. Father Kael, he began without preamble, you have completed initial orientation and conducted successful confessions with upper-tier penitents. The Ecclesiarchy liaison has reviewed your reports and deemed your performance acceptable. Therefore, you are now authorized to minister to Level 13 containment. Level 13. The lowest accessible deck. The maximum security holds I had been explicitly forbidden from entering during my orientation, where the worst cases were kept, those whose psychic manifestations were so violent or uncontrolled that even the ship's suppression systems struggled to contain them. I am prepared to fulfill this duty, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the cold dread settling into my stomach. Father Demetrius refused this duty, Horvath said, his augmetic eye focusing on me with uncomfortable intensity. In his 11 years of service, he never descended below level 10. He claimed that some souls were beyond ministration, that attempting to provide spiritual comfort to certain penitents risked the confessor's sanity and soul. Do you share his assessment? The question was a test. If I refused, I would be acknowledging limits to my faith and courage. If I accepted, I would be walking willingly into whatever had frightened a veteran confessor enough to refuse. Either way, I understood that my answer would define the remainder of my service aboard this vessel. The Emperor's light reaches even the darkest corners, I said. If these penitents require spiritual ministration, then I will provide it. That is my calling." Horvath nodded once, sharply. "Sister Octavia will escort you. The protocols are the same, but I am authorizing additional null guards and remote sedation systems. If at any point the situation becomes untenable, she will extract you by force if necessary. Is this understood?" "Yes, Captain." "Then may the Emperor protect you, Father." "You are dismissed." Sister Octavia was waiting outside the captain's quarters. She led me to an armory station, where I was issued additional protective gear. A personal void shield generator worn as a belt, blessed purity seals to be affixed to my vestments, and a small charm inscribed with hexagrammic wards that burned cold against my palm. She typed on her data slate. "These are standard precautions. Do not remove them under any circumstances." The descent to level 13 took nearly 20 minutes. We passed through multiple security checkpoints, each requiring biometric verification and psychic scanning. The temperature dropped with each level, and by the time we reached our destination, my breath misted white in the frigid air. The walls here were not merely inscribed with hexagrammic wards, but plated with them, overlapping protective symbols covering every centimeter of surface. The lighting was dim, emergency lumens casting everything in shades of red and shadow. The architecture itself felt wrong. Angles that should have been perpendicular seemed slightly off. Corridors that should have been straight appeared to curve at their periphery. I told myself it was psychological, the stress of the environment playing tricks on perception. But the rational explanation felt thin, inadequate to explain the profound sense of spatial wrongness that permeated this place. We stopped before a cell designated Maximum Containment 7. Through the reinforced viewing port, I could see a woman, perhaps 40 standard years old, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall. She appeared lucid, her eyes focused rather than vacant. Her gray shift was clean, and she showed none of the physical deterioration I had observed in other long-term prisoners. According to the data slate, she was Penitent 135 Seraphine, Origin World Classified, Manifestation Classified, Threat Assessment Extreme. The guards who accompanied us were different from those on upper levels. These wore full void-sealed armor with integrated life support. Their weapons were not shock mauls but melta-guns, capable of reducing flesh and bone to superheated vapor in seconds. They took positions at calculated angles that would allow them to fire into the cell without hitting each other or Sister Octavia. This was not protection, this was a firing squad waiting for authorization. A servitor wheeled forward a portable confessional screen, setting it up before the cell. The woman inside watched these preparations with what seemed like mild curiosity. When everything was ready, the cell door opened with a hydraulic hiss. The woman stood smoothly and walked to the confessional position without being instructed. She knelt on the penitent's side of the screen, and I took my place opposite her. "In the name of the God Emperor of mankind," I began, "speak your sins that they may be witnessed." "Which sins would you like to hear first, Father?" Her voice was cultured, educated, nothing like the ravings I had expected from someone classified as extreme threat. "The sins I committed with my own hands, or the sins I committed through the hands of others. Begin where you feel moved to begin." "I murdered my family," she said simply, as if discussing weather patterns. "My husband, my 3 children, my parents who lived with us, and 14 servants who happened to be present in our estate. I killed them all, personally, efficiently, over the course of one evening." The clinical detachment in her voice was more disturbing than any display of emotion would have been. "Why?" I asked. "Mercy, Father. I killed them as an act of profound mercy, because I had seen what was coming for them, and death by my hand was infinitely preferable to what the warp would make of them if they remained alive." She leaned closer to the screen, and I could see her eyes now. The pupils were normal, but the irises contained depths that should not exist in human anatomy. as if I were looking not at colored tissue but into vast distances. I am a true seer, Father, not a precognitive catching glimpses of possible futures, but one who perceives actual trajectories of fate. I see the threads of causality, the paths that lead from now to then. And I saw, with absolute clarity, what would happen to my family if I allowed them to live. What did you see? Things I cannot describe in any language humans speak. The warp recognizes bloodlines, Father. It marks families that carry latent psychic potential. My manifestation was the activation of a curse that had lain dormant in my genetic line for generations. Once I opened that door, everything connected to me became visible to entities that hunger. My family would have been consumed, but not cleanly. They would have been transformed, violated, turned into vessels for things that wear human skin like poorly fitted clothing. I gave them death while they were still themselves. That was my gift to them. Despite the horror of what she described, I found myself listening with a terrible fascination. There was logic in her madness, a coherent framework that made sense if you accepted her fundamental premise. And you believe this absolves you of murder. I do not seek absolution, Father. I seek only witness. I killed the people I loved most in all the galaxy, to spare them a fate worse than death. I carry that weight, and I will carry it to Terra, and I will carry it through whatever binding or transformation awaits me there. I am not asking you to tell me I was right. I am asking you to acknowledge that I did what I believed necessary. Before I could respond, something shifted in the cell. The air pressure changed. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in an instant, and I felt it, a presence, vast and alien, turning its attention toward us like a searchlight sweeping across dark terrain. Seraphine's expression changed, becoming distant. "It is here," she whispered, "the thing that has been watching this ship. It has been waiting for a door to open, and confession is such a perfect door. You speak your darkness into the light, but light casts shadows, Father, and in those shadows, things listen." Then I experienced something that should not have been possible. A psychic bleed, direct transference of experience from her mind into mine. I was not merely told what she had seen, I saw it through her eyes. Her estate on some civilized world whose name did not matter. Evening light streaming through tall windows. Her family gathered for dinner, laughing, normal, human. And then the vision shifted, and I saw them as she had seen them, as corpses waiting to happen, as meat that would be hollowed out and filled with writhing things from beyond reality. I saw the specific moment when each one would break, when their minds would shatter and something else would move in. I saw her husband's face melting like wax as something wearing his shape turned toward her with eyes that held nothing but hunger. The vision ended as suddenly as it began. I found myself gasping, pressed back against my side of the confessional screen, my heart hammering in my chest. Sister Octavia was there immediately, her null presence cutting through the psychic resonance like a blade through flesh. The guards had their weapons raised, targeting solutions calculated and ready to execute on her signal. Seraphine slumped forward, blood trickling from her nose. But the thing watching us, it wanted you to understand. It wanted you to know what confession truly means aboard this ship. Every sin spoken aloud resonates in the warp. Every darkness revealed creates a beacon. And something out there collects these beacons, feeds on them, grows stronger with each one. Sister Octavia gestured sharply. The guards moved forward, dragging Seraphine back into her cell. The door sealed with a sound like a tomb closing. Through the viewing port, I watched her curl into a fetal position, trembling. Whatever had moved through her during our confession had taken a physical toll. Sister Octavia's data slate glowed. "You will report to Medicae immediately. You experienced psychic contact. Protocol requires examination." But I was not thinking about protocol. I was thinking about the vision she had shown me, about the look of desperate love in her eyes as she murdered her family to save them from something worse. and I was thinking about the presence I had felt, the vast attention that had turned toward us during that moment of psychic vulnerability. The Medicae examination found nothing physically wrong with me. My vital signs were elevated but within acceptable parameters for someone who had experienced psychological trauma. The psychic resonance scans showed trace signatures of warp contact, but nothing that suggested corruption or possession. The Medicae prescribed rest and observation. Standard protocol. After close exposure to an extreme threat penitent, I did not rest. I returned to my quarters, performed my evening devotions, and lay on my bunk staring at the ceiling while my mind replayed the vision Seraphine had forced into my consciousness. The image of her family, whole and human one moment, then hollow and inhabited the next. The terrible logic that had driven her to become a murderer to prevent something worse. And underneath it all, the sensation of something vast watching, waiting, feeding on the spiritual vulnerability that confession created. Over the following days, I continued my duties. Morning prayers in the chapel, followed by confession sessions with penitents from various containment levels. Young and old, violent and passive, lucid and mad. Each brought their sins to me, and I witnessed them according to my calling. But something had changed. A pattern was emerging that I could not ignore. The confessions were beginning to connect. Not obviously, not in ways that would be immediately apparent to someone not listening carefully, but themes repeated, phrases echoed across different penitents. References to the listener appeared in confession after confession, spoken by individuals who had no contact with each other, who were housed on different levels and brought to the chapel days apart. A teenage girl confessed to setting fire to her school dormitory, killing 7 classmates. Midway through describing her crime, she said, "I heard a voice telling me they deserved it. The listener said they would have betrayed me eventually." 2 days later, an elderly man confessing to poisoning his wife used almost identical phrasing. The listener told me she planned to leave me. It showed me the future where I died alone. I documented these repetitions in my reports to Captain Horvath, framing them as evidence of psychic contamination or shared delusion among the cargo. He acknowledged my observations, but offered no explanation. The ship's astropath, consulted regarding the phenomenon, suggested it was likely psychic bleed-over thoughts and fears spreading among the imprisoned psychers through mechanisms the Imperium did not fully understand. But I knew it was more than that. The listener was not a shared delusion. It was something real, something that had learned my spiritual signature through the confessions I had witnessed. The boy Davos had warned me. Seraphine had shown me. And now every confession I heard seemed designed to reinforce that connection. The critical incident occurred during a confession with a young woman designated 347 Clara. She was 17 standard years old, manifested as a telepath, classified as moderate threat. Her crime was minor compared to others I had heard. She had inadvertently read the thoughts of a planetary governor during a reception, learning classified military information that she then shared with friends. The Inquisition had determined her manifestation was accidental rather than deliberate espionage, but she was still cargo-bound for Terra. She knelt in the confessional booth, Sister Octavia and the guards in their usual positions. She spoke of her fear, her confusion about what was happening to her, her desperate wish that none of this had occurred. Standard anxieties from someone whose life had been destroyed by abilities they never asked for. Then her voice changed. Not dramatically, not the multiple voice phenomenon I had experienced with Davos. Just a subtle shift in cadence and tone, as if someone else was speaking through her mouth while she remained unaware. "You carry weight, Father Matthias," she said, though we had not been discussing me. "Do you remember them all?" "Of course you do. Every confessor remembers. The darkness accumulates, layer upon layer, until you cannot recall what your soul felt like before you began carrying others' burdens." My hands tightened on the edge of the confessional screen. "Clara, we are here to discuss your confession, not Mine. But I am discussing mine, Father. I confess that I can read your thoughts right now. I can see your memories as clearly as if they were my own. Would you like me to prove it? That will not be necessary. I glanced toward Sister Octavia, ready to signal for intervention. But she had not moved, had given no indication that anything unusual was occurring. Perhaps this was still within acceptable parameters for a telepathic penitent. 12 years ago, Clara continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality, a man came to your cathedral. His name was Hendrik Voss. He confessed to beating his wife and children, to inflicting injuries that required medical attention. He wept and claimed remorse. You gave him absolution according to Ecclesiarchy doctrine. You told him the emperor forgave those who genuinely repented. You sent him home, believing himself cleansed. Ice formed in my veins. This was the incident the boy Davos had referenced, the decision that haunted me still. But Clara could not possibly know about it. Hendrik Voss had confessed privately, and I had told no one about the case. 3 weeks later, she said, and now her voice was definitely not her own, carrying harmonics that should not exist in human speech. Hendrik Voss killed his wife, his 3 children, and his elderly mother before taking his own life. 5 people dead because you chose mercy over justice, because you believed confession and absolution could change a man's nature. But some natures cannot be changed, Father. Some sins are not aberrations, but expressions of fundamental character. Stop, I said, my voice cracking. This is not your confession. You are being used as a conduit for something else. Am I? She tilted her head, and through the screen I saw her eyes had changed. The pupils were dilated fully, showing only thin rings of iris, and in their darkness I saw depth that should not exist. Or am I simply telling you what you already know? That every confession you hear leaves a mark. That every sin witnessed creates a connection between confessor and penitent. That these connections accumulate until you become something more than a simple priest. You become a repository, a vessel, a listener. She leaned forward, and I smelled something wrong, an odor like spoiled flowers and old copper. Let me tell you your other secrets, Father. Shall I speak of the doubt you harbor about the Emperor's divinity? How you wonder if prayers are heard or merely spoken into void? Shall I mention the envy you felt toward other priests who received prestigious assignments while you remained in the same cathedral for 2 decades? Or perhaps we should discuss the cardinal's niece, the one who came to you for spiritual guidance, whom you found attractive despite your vows. Each word was a violation, pulling thoughts and feelings I had never voiced, fears and shames I had confessed only to the Emperor in my most private prayers. This was not mere telepathy. This was something reaching through Clara to rifle through my soul like examining documents in an archive. You think you minister to the cargo, the voice continued. But in truth, you minister to me. Every confession you hear aboard this vessel feeds me. Every sin spoken aloud resonates in the warp, and I collect that resonance like a miser hoarding coins. I grow stronger with each dark secret revealed, each burden transferred from penitent to confessor. And you, Father Matthias Kael, you have such capacity for burden-bearing, such strength to hear darkness without breaking. You are perfect. Sister Octavia moved. One moment she was standing at her post. The next, she was inside the confessional booth, her hand pressed against Clara's forehead. The girl convulsed, her back arching impossibly, and from her mouth came a scream that held no humanity in it. The sound seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly in my skull. And for a moment, I experienced absolute terror. Not fear of death or pain, but terror at the fundamental wrongness of what I was perceiving. Then silence. Clara collapsed forward, unconscious. Blood trickled from her nose, ears, and eyes. Sister Octavia checked her pulse, then gestured sharply to the guards. They carried the girl away, her body limp as a doll's. Sister Octavia turned to me, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something approaching emotion in her blank features. Concern, or perhaps recognition of danger. She typed on her data slate, "This is escalating. 3 significant incidents in 2 weeks. Pattern suggests focused attention rather than random warp phenomena. Recommend suspension of confession duties pending review." "I cannot suspend my duties," I said, though my hands trembled and my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "These penitents require spiritual ministration. That is why I am here." Her response was immediate. "These penitents require many things. What they do not require is a confessor being corrupted or consumed. You are being targeted. Something in the warp has marked you. Each confession strengthens that connection. You must stop. I will not abandon my calling because it has become dangerous." She stared at me for a long moment, then typed, "Pride, the first sin, the one that damns most surely." She left without waiting for response, her departure a wordless condemnation. I remained in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, seeking guidance in prayer, but the words felt hollow. The familiar litanies offered no comfort. And in the silence between prayers, I heard it clearly now. Breathing. Patient, attentive breathing. As if something sat beside me in the darkness, listening to every word I spoke. That night, I dreamed of confession. An endless line of penitents waiting to speak their sins, each one revealing not their own darkness, but mine. Every secret shame, every doubt, every moment of weakness displayed for judgment. And at the end of the line, a figure sat in the confessor's booth, waiting to hear my confession. I could not see its face, but I knew with absolute certainty that when I finally knelt before it and spoke my sins aloud, the thing waiting would not offer absolution. It would simply listen. And in that listening, I would be consumed. I ignored Sister Octavia's recommendation. For 3 more days, I continued hearing confessions, driven by a conviction that felt less like faith and more like compulsion. Each session revealed more of my hidden thoughts, more private shames pulled from penitents who should not have known them. The guards grew increasingly uneasy. Even Sister Octavia's blank presence seemed strained, as if maintaining her null field against whatever was focusing attention on the chapel required effort that exhausted even her inhuman endurance. On the 4th day, Father Demetrius was found dead in his quarters. The official report listed heart failure as cause of death, common enough for a man of his advanced years. But I was summoned to identify the body, and what I saw contradicted that clinical assessment. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, mouth open in a scream that had never emerged. And on his forearm, carved in shallow cuts that wept clear fluid, were 2 words: "It listens." The ship's Medicae insisted the cuts were self-inflicted, evidence of psychological breakdown in his final moments. Captain Horvath accepted this explanation and ordered the body prepared for reclamation. But I knew better. Father Demetrius had served aboard black ships for 11 years. He had refused to descend to level 13, had warned me about the dangers I now faced. He had known what hunted confessors aboard these vessels, and that knowledge had not saved him. I requested permission to conduct one final confession before submitting to full psychological evaluation. Captain Horvath granted it, perhaps believing that allowing me to complete my current rotation would provide closure. Or perhaps he simply wanted to observe how far the deterioration would progress. Either way, I was given authorization for a maximum security confession session with enhanced protocols. Additional null guards, remote sedation systems activated, and immediate extraction procedures on standby. The penitent they brought was designated 892 Nathaniel. His file was sparse, containing only basic information. Male, approximately 40 standard years, manifested as low-level empath. Origin, world classified. No record of violent incidents, no indication of extreme threat classification. An unremarkable prisoner among thousands, someone who should have warranted only routine spiritual ministration. But when they brought him into the chapel, I knew immediately that something was wrong. He moved with absolute calm, showing none of the fear or anxiety that characterized most penitents. His gray shift was pristine despite weeks of confinement. His face was unremarkable, neither handsome nor ugly, neither young nor old, the kind of face that would disappear in any crowd. And his eyes, when they met mine, held an intelligence that seemed ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. Sister Octavia positioned herself directly beside the confessional entrance, closer than she had ever stood before. The null guards formed a tight perimeter, 4 of them, instead of the usual 2. The air in the chapel felt heavy, oppressive, as if atmospheric pressure was building toward some inevitable release. Nathaniel knelt in the confessional booth with movements that seemed almost ceremonial. I took my position opposite him, my hands gripping the edge of the screen hard enough that my knuckles went white. Through the wrought silver, his unremarkable face was fragmentary, incomplete, as if the screen was struggling to properly reflect his image. "In the name of the God Emperor of mankind," I began, my voice steady through sheer force of will. "Speak your sins, that they may be witnessed." "I was a priest once," he said, and his voice was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not the multiple voice phenomenon or unnatural harmonics. Just subtly off, like a perfect recording played at slightly incorrect speed. "Much like you, Father Matthias, I ministered to the faithful on a shrine world whose name no longer matters. I heard confessions for 37 years before they assigned me to a black ship. Before I learned what confession truly means when spoken aboard vessels like this. I am not here to hear your professional history," I said. "I am here to witness your sins. But my sins and my history are inseparable, you see. Because my greatest sin was believing that confession was a sacred act, that speaking darkness into light somehow cleansed the soul. I did not understand that confession is a transaction, that spiritual vulnerability has weight in realms beyond the material. I did not understand that some things listen very carefully when humans speak their deepest shames aloud." The temperature in the chapel dropped. I could see my breath misting. The candles on the altar flickered, though there was no wind. Sister Octavia's stance shifted subtly, ready to intervene at the first sign of active manifestation. "Stop speaking in metaphors," I demanded. "Very well." He leaned closer to the screen, and I realized his face was changing. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious if you were not watching carefully, but the unremarkable features were shifting, becoming more familiar, taking on aspects that I recognized. He was beginning to look like me. My sin is that I fed something without knowing I was feeding it. Every confession I heard aboard my black ship created resonance in the warp. Every sin spoken aloud sent ripples through the immaterium. And something in that realm of chaos and hunger learned to follow those ripples back to their source. To the listener, to the confessor who bore witness. His voice changed. And suddenly, it was not one voice, but many, layered and harmonious and terrible. The voices of every penitent I had heard since boarding the Misericordia Ultima. Young Elara's frightened whisper, Goran's military discipline, Clara's dreamy cadence, Davos's multiple tones, Seraphine's cultured detachment, all of them speaking through Nathaniel's mouth in perfect synchronization. "We are the confessions you have heard, Father. Every sin spoken in your presence, every darkness revealed, every shame acknowledged. We exist in the space between penitent and confessor, in that moment of vulnerability when the soul opens itself to judgment. And we are sustained by something that has always existed wherever confession occurs. Something that feeds on spiritual exposure the way predators feed on wounded prey. The null guards moved forward, responding to some signal I had not consciously registered. But Nathaniel, or whatever was using Nathaniel's body, raised one hand in a gesture that was almost gentle. And they stopped. Not frozen, not paralyzed. Simply stopped as if they had forgotten why they were moving. "I am not a demon," the chorus of voices said. "That is what you are thinking, is it not? That I am some entity of chaos, some warp spawn that has breached containment. But I am older than the chaos gods, more fundamental than their corruption. I am the natural consequence of confession itself, the witness that exists whenever someone speaks their darkness aloud, the listener that pays attention when souls make themselves vulnerable." Through the screen, Nathaniel's face had completed its transformation. He looked exactly like me now, a perfect mirror image. And when he smiled, it was my smile rendered somehow wrong. Think about the nature of confession, Father. A person comes before you and reveals their deepest shame, their most carefully hidden sin. They make themselves spiritually naked before you, trusting that you will not condemn them, that you will offer understanding and absolution. But that trust, that vulnerability, it creates a connection, a thread between speaker and listener. And where there are threads, things can crawl. "You are lying," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Confession is a sacred rite, blessed by the Emperor himself. It cleanses the soul." "Does it?" All the voices spoke in perfect unison now. "Or does it simply transfer the burden from penitent to confessor? You have carried the sins of 50,000 people across 20 years of service, Father Matthias. You bear the weight of their darkness, their violence, their failures. Do you truly believe that weight has nowhere to go? That it simply dissipates into the spiritual ether?" He leaned close enough that I could feel his breath through the screen, though no breath should carry that distance. "It goes to me. Every confession you hear feeds me. Every sin witnessed strengthens the connection between us. You are a collector, Father, gathering spiritual vulnerability on my behalf. And aboard this black ship, surrounded by thousands of psychers whose very thoughts create ripples in the warp, that collection has accelerated magnificently." Sister Octavia moved with speed that blurred her form. Her hand shot through the screen, pressing against Nathaniel's forehead with her null field at maximum intensity. He convulsed violently. The borrowed features of my face, distorting into something that was neither him, nor me, nor anything human. The chorus of voices screamed, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off walls and ceiling and floor until the entire chapel resonated with anguish. But even as he convulsed, even as Sister Octavia's null presence tore at whatever was manifesting through him, the voices continued speaking. "You cannot silence me by silencing this vessel, Sister. I am already inside him. Inside the confessor. Every word he has heard, every sin he has witnessed, every moment of spiritual vulnerability he has facilitated, they are all threads connecting him to me. And I am patient. I will wait in those threads, feeding on everything he continues to hear, growing stronger with each confession, until the moment comes when he realizes the truth." What truth? I found myself asking despite everything, despite the horror unfolding before me. The voices laughed, and it was the saddest sound I had ever heard. "That you are not the confessor, Father Matthias. You are the penitent, and I am your confessor. Everything you have heard, all the darkness you have witnessed, all the weight you have carried, it was always your confession to me. You have been speaking your sins through the mouths of others, revealing yourself piece by piece, making yourself vulnerable in the exact way confession demands. And now that you understand this, now that you see the pattern, you cannot stop." Nathaniel's body went limp. The voices ceased as if a Vox unit had been powered down. Sister Octavia released him, and he collapsed to the floor, blood streaming from his nose and ears. The guards moved forward immediately, checking vital signs. His heart still beat, but his eyes were vacant, empty of any consciousness. Whatever had been using him had burned through his mind like fire through parchment, leaving only a shell. Sister Octavia turned to me, and this time there was no mistaking the emotion in her blank features. It was not concern, it was pity. She typed rapidly on her data slate, then held it up for me to read. It was right. You are marked. Every confession strengthens the connection. You must stop immediately. But even as I read her words, even as I watched the guards carry away Nathaniel's brain-dead body, I knew I would not stop, could not stop. The entity had understood me perfectly. My pride, my conviction that I could bear any burden, my certainty that my faith was strong enough to endure any trial, these were not strengths. They were the exact vulnerabilities that would ensure I continued feeding it, because to stop would be to admit weakness. And I had spent 20 years proving I was strong enough to carry darkness without breaking. The entity had not invaded me. I had invited it in with every confession I heard, every sin I witnessed, every burden I accepted. And now it would feed on me until there was nothing left but an empty vessel, wearing a confessor's robes, still hearing confessions, still feeding the hunger that wore the shape of spiritual service. They confined me to quarters for 3 days. Not as punishment, but as protection. Protection for the cargo, protection for the crew, and perhaps protection for whatever remained of my sanity. Captain Horvath personally delivered the confinement order, his augmetic eye whirring as it scanned my face for signs of corruption or possession. He found neither, because the entity had been truthful about one thing. It was not a daemon that invaded from without. It was something that emerged from the act of confession itself, from the spaces between vulnerability and witness. Sister Octavia stood guard outside my quarters, her null presence a constant pressure against the bulkhead. I could feel her emptiness, even through the reinforced door, a void that should have been comforting but instead felt like condemnation. She was immune to what afflicted me. Her psychic absence meant she could never understand faith, could never experience the spiritual connection that confession was supposed to create. But that immunity also meant she could perceive what I was becoming with terrible clarity. She watched me the way one watches a plague victim, waiting to see if the disease would prove fatal. The ship's astropath came on the 2nd day. He was ancient, his body withered from decades of psychic exertion, his eyes burned away during soul binding and replaced with augmetic sensors that glowed with pale blue light. He shuffled into my quarters, supported by a servo harness, settling into the room's single chair with mechanical assistance. Sister Octavia remained in the corridor, her presence too disruptive to psychic examination. Father Kael, the astropath began, his voice like wind through dead leaves. I am Astropath Secundus Valen. The captain has requested I evaluate your psychic contamination and determine whether you present risk to the ship's spiritual integrity. I am not a psyker, I said. I possess no warp-touched abilities. No, he agreed. But you have become entangled with something that does. The confessions you have heard aboard this vessel created resonance in the immaterium. That resonance attracted attention from an entity that exists in the liminal space between material and warp. It has marked you, Father. Your spiritual signature is now recognizable to certain denizens of the Sea of Souls. He leaned forward, augmetic eyes adjusting their focus with tiny mechanical clicks. I can perceive these marks the way you might perceive ink stains on parchment. They cover you, layer upon layer, each one representing a confession you have witnessed. The marks are not corruption in the traditional sense. You are not tainted by chaos, but you have become a beacon, broadcasting spiritual vulnerability into the warp with every breath you take. Can it be removed? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No. These marks are not something applied to you from outside. They are consequences of your actions, of your choice to bear witness to others' sins in an environment saturated with psychic energy. They are part of you now, woven into your spiritual essence as surely as memories are woven into consciousness. The only way to remove them would be to somehow erase every confession you have ever heard, and that is beyond any technology or ritual the Imperium possesses. He paused, his glowing eyes dimming slightly. I have encountered similar cases before, though rarely. Confessors who serve aboard black ships sometimes develop these patterns. Most do not survive long enough for the marks to accumulate dangerously. They go mad, or they suicide, or they simply waste away as their minds fragment under the weight of carried darkness. Father Demetrius lasted 11 years, which is exceptional. Most die within their first voyage. Father Demetrius refused to minister below level 10, I said. He recognized the danger and set boundaries to protect himself. Yes, wise man. He understood that some souls are too dangerous to witness, that attempting to provide spiritual comfort to certain penitents risks the confessor's sanity and soul. You, however, accepted no such boundaries. You descended to level 13. You heard confessions from extreme threat cargo. You opened yourself to the worst darkness aboard this vessel. And something in the warp took notice of your capacity to absorb suffering. Valen stood with servo harness assistants, preparing to depart. The captain will want my recommendation regarding your continued service. What should I tell him, Father? That you are stable enough to resume duties? That you present acceptable risk to the ship and cargo? Or should I recommend you be confined for the remainder of the voyage, kept away from the penitents you seem determined to destroy yourself trying to save? I met his augmetic gaze. Tell him I understand what I am facing. Tell him I know the entity feeds on confessions I hear. Tell him I am not possessed, not corrupted, simply entangled with something that exists wherever confession occurs. And tell him that I will continue my duties, because that is my calling. Your pride will kill you, Valen said, echoing Sister Octavia's earlier assessment. But that is a choice you are entitled to make. I will report that you are psychically marked but not compromised, aware of your condition but determined to continue service. The captain can decide what to do with that information. 1. He shuffled from my quarters, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing certainty that I was approaching a threshold from which there would be no return. The entity had been correct. I could not stop. To abandon confession would be to admit that my faith was insufficient, that I was too weak to bear the burden of ministry. And I had built my entire identity around the opposite conviction that I was strong enough to carry any darkness, wise enough to provide comfort to any suffering soul. On the third day, Captain Horvath summoned me to his quarters. Sister Octavia escorted me through corridors that seemed darker than before, as if the ship's lumens had dimmed or my perception had shifted toward shadow. We passed crew members who averted their eyes, made warding signs, hurried away. Word had spread about what happened during Nathaniel's confession. I had become something to be feared, a vector for warp contamination even though I carried no taint myself. Horvath sat behind his desk, my confession reports displayed on hololithic screens surrounding him. He dismissed Sister Octavia with a gesture, and she withdrew to the corridor, closing the door but remaining close enough to intervene if necessary. Astropath Valen has submitted his evaluation, Horvath began. He reports that you are psychically marked, but not corrupted, aware of your condition, and determined to continue duties. Is his assessment accurate? Yes, Captain. Then I must inform you of options available under current circumstances. Option 1. You are relieved of confession duties for the remainder of this voyage. You remain aboard as chaplain, providing general spiritual guidance, but do not conduct private confessions with cargo. Upon reaching Terra, you are reassigned to station duty, ministering to sanctioned psychers and astropathic choir. He paused, studying my reaction. Option 2. You continue confession duties under enhanced protocols. Every session monitored by multiple null guards. Every penitent screened by astropaths before being brought to chapel. duration and frequency of confessions reduced to minimize exposure. Upon reaching Terra, you are evaluated for permanent assignment to Black Ship service. And option 3? I asked, because I could see in his expression that there was a third possibility he was reluctant to voice. Option 3 is that we recognize you have become too entangled with the entity to continue safely. You are confined for the remainder of the voyage, subjected to extensive psychic cleansing upon reaching Terra, and if cleansing proves successful, reassigned to duties far from any environment saturated with psychic energy. If cleansing fails, you are deemed spiritually compromised and dealt with accordingly. Dealt with accordingly. A bureaucratic euphemism for execution or servitor conversion. I would be classified as acceptable loss, my death or transformation, a reasonable price to prevent further warp contamination. I choose option 1, I said, and watched surprise flicker across Horvath's face. He had expected me to insist on continuing confessions, to demonstrate the pride that both Valen and Sister Octavia had identified as my defining weakness. That is unexpected, Father. May I ask, what changed your perspective? The entity was correct about one thing, I said slowly, working through understanding even as I spoke. Confession aboard a Black Ship is not the same as confession in a cathedral. The presence of thousands of psychers changes the spiritual equation. Every sin spoken aloud resonates in the warp, and things pay attention to that resonance. I cannot prevent this phenomenon, but I can refuse to participate in it. I can stop feeding the entity by simply declining to hear confessions. Horvath nodded slowly. A mature decision. I commend your wisdom in recognizing your limitations. However, I continued, I request permission to continue ministering to the cargo in other capacities. Group prayers, general sermons, spiritual guidance that does not involve private confession. The penitents still require comfort, still need to know the Emperor has not abandoned them. I can provide that without creating the vulnerability that confession demands. Granted, Horvath said immediately, relief evident in his tone. Sister Octavia will escort you to all such sessions. You will not be alone with cargo under any circumstances. Is this acceptable? Yes, Captain. Thank you. I returned to my quarters and spent the remainder of that day in contemplation. The entity had fed on my pride, my conviction that I was strong enough to bear any burden. But pride was not faith. Recognizing my limitations was not weakness. The truest strength might lie in admitting that some burdens were too heavy to carry, that some darkness was too deep to witness safely. That night I dreamed differently, not of endless confessions or of the figure waiting in the confessor's booth. Instead, I dreamed of the chapel on Ophelia 7, of the simple joy I had once found in ministry before everything became complicated by warp entities and psychic resonance. I dreamed of penitents who confessed ordinary sins and received ordinary absolution, of spiritual transactions that did not require navigating between material and immaterium. I dreamed of being simply a priest again, rather than a battlefield in a war I did not fully understand. When I woke, the whispers that had haunted me since Seraphine's confession were silent. The presence I had felt watching me was diminished, as if by refusing to feed it, I had broken some essential connection. The marks Valen described might still cover my spiritual essence, but they were fading, becoming scars rather than open wounds. Sister Octavia came for me at morning cycle. Her data slate message was brief. Captain authorizes you to conduct group prayer session, level 9 cargo. 20 penitents. I will be present throughout. I dressed in my vestments, gathered my prayer books, and followed her to the chapel. The 20 penitents, all from upper levels, all classified low threat, filed in underguard supervision. They took seats on the simple wooden pews, their gray shifts rustling softly, their faces showing varying degrees of hope and fear and resignation. I stood before them at the altar, beneath the bronze aquila, and spoke not of their sins, but of the Emperor's design, of how even suffering had purpose within his infinite plan, of how their curse might become blessing through sanctioning, their weakness transformed into strength serving humanity. I offered no absolution, because I made no inquiry into their individual darknesses. I simply bore witness to their collective fear and offered what comfort theology allowed. When the session ended and the penitents were escorted back to their cells, one of them, a young man whose designation I had not bothered to learn, turned back to look at me. His expression held something I had not seen in any cargo's face before. Peace. Not joy, not hope, but simple peace. The acceptance of fate without the burden of confession. Perhaps this was what ministry meant aboard a black ship. Not absolving sins, but acknowledging suffering. Not hearing darkness, but standing witness to it without being consumed. Not feeding entities in the warp, but simply offering human presence to those who had been deemed less than human by the Imperium's cruel necessities. The Misericordia Ultima approached Terra after 4 months in the warp. 4 months during which I had not heard a single private confession. I conducted group prayer sessions 3 times per week, led devotional services in the chapel, and walked the containment levels, offering what comfort could be given through bars and reinforced glass. The whispers that had plagued me diminished to occasional murmurs, easily dismissed as shipboard sounds or the product of fatigue. The marks Astropath Valen had described were fading, or perhaps I had simply learned to live with their weight. The penitents responded to this different form of ministry with surprising openness. Without the formal structure of confession, without the demand that they name and detail their sins, many spoke more freely about their fears and hopes. They asked questions about Terra, about what awaited them, about whether the Emperor truly cared for cursed souls like themselves. I answered as honestly as doctrine allowed, offering neither false comfort nor unnecessary cruelty. Simply truth, as much as I understood it. Sister Octavia remained my constant guardian, but her presence shifted from warden to something approaching companionship. She never spoke, could never speak, but her data slate messages grew more conversational. She asked about my theological training, about life on Ophelia 7, about whether I believed the Emperor actually listened to prayers. I answered her questions, and in doing so, found myself examining beliefs I had held for decades without truly scrutinizing them. Did I believe the Emperor heard prayers? I did not know. Perhaps he did. Perhaps consciousness on the Golden Throne extended across the galaxy, perceiving the spiritual states of every faithful soul. Or perhaps prayer was simply a mechanism for humans to process their own fear and hope, to create meaning in a universe that offered little. Either way, the act of praying served a purpose. That had to be enough. The ship's translation back into real space was violent. The warp drives disengaged with a shudder that rattled every bulkhead. And suddenly the viewport in my quarters showed not infinite darkness but the cradle of humanity itself. Terra hung against the void like a jewel wrapped in adamantium and ceramite, its surface obscured by orbital stations and defense platforms so numerous they formed layers around the planet. The sheer scale of it defied comprehension. Millions of ships, billions of souls, all orbiting the world where humanity had been born and where the Emperor had ruled before his interment in the Golden Throne. Even I, possessing no psychic sensitivity whatsoever, could feel something emanating from the planet. A pressure in the mind, a weight that suggested vast attention focused on purposes beyond mortal understanding. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided navigators through the warp, blazed from Terra like a lighthouse whose illumination could be perceived across the galaxy. Standing near my viewport, I felt simultaneously insignificant and acknowledged, as if the Emperor's regard swept across me for the briefest instant before moving on to more important concerns. The cargo felt it more intensely. I heard them through the bulkheads, thousands of voices rising in response to proximity to the Golden Throne. Some wept, some prayed, some screamed. The ship's psychic suppression systems strained to contain the resonance created by so many warp-touched minds responding to the Emperor's presence. Null guards doubled their patrols, and several high-threat penitents were sedated as a precautionary measure. Captain Horvath summoned all senior staff to the bridge for final approach briefing. The bridge was a cathedral of technology, cogitators and tactical displays surrounding a central command throne where Horvath sat like a lord presiding over his domain. Through the massive viewport, Terra grew larger as we descended toward Luna, the moon that served as the primary processing station for Black Ship cargo. "We will dock at Luna Station 7 in approximately 6 hours," Horvath announced. "Offloading procedures will commence immediately. The cargo will be transferred to administratum custody for evaluation and processing. Crew will have 72 hours of authorized shore leave on Terra proper, staggered to maintain minimum operational staffing. Father Kael, you are requested to remain aboard during offloading to provide spiritual comfort to cargo during transfer." I nodded acknowledgement. Watching the penitents I had ministered to for 4 months being herded away to soul binding or death would be the final test of whether I had truly learned anything during this voyage. The approach to Luna took most of the day. We passed through layer after layer of orbital defenses, each requiring authentication and clearance from increasingly senior officials. The fortress facilities on Luna's surface were vast beyond comprehension. Structures that had been expanded continuously for 10,000 years until they covered entire regions of the moon's surface. The primary Black Ship processing station was designated Somnus Citadel, a name that meant sleep in ancient Terran languages. An apt description for what awaited the cargo, the sleep of soul binding, or the eternal sleep of becoming fuel for the Astronomicon. We docked with Luna Station 7 as the chronometer marked hour 23 of shipboard cycle. The docking clamps engaged with deep metallic thuds that resonated through every level. Through my viewport, I could see the station's receiving bay, a massive space large enough to hold 3 vessels the size of the Misericordia Ultima. Administratum personnel in gray uniforms swarmed across docking bridges. Sisters of Silence moved in perfect formation, their null presence creating visible distortions where psychic suppression met station atmosphere. And behind them, servitors by the hundreds, mindless automatons, prepared to handle cargo processing with mechanical efficiency. Sister Octavia came to my quarters and gestured for me to follow. We descended to level 9, where the offloading would begin with lowest threat cargo. The penitents were already being organized into groups of 50. Each group assigned identification codes and processing numbers. They wore the same gray shifts they had worn for months. But now, each shift bore an additional marking. A red skull stamped over the heart, the symbol indicating they were bound for Terra, for purposes the Emperor alone fully comprehended. Young Elara was in the first group. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, as if the months of confinement and psychic suppression had physically diminished her. When she saw me standing near the processing corridor, her face brightened slightly. Not with hope, she was too intelligent for false hope, but with recognition. Someone familiar in this final transition. I approached as close as protocols allowed. "Elara," I said gently, "how do you fare?" "I am afraid, Father." Her voice was steady despite the confession. "But I remember what you said, that my suffering has meaning in the Emperor's design, that I will serve even if I do not survive. I am holding to that. Then you are stronger than most adults I have known. The Emperor will recognize that strength, child. Of this, I am certain." She nodded once, a gesture of acceptance rather than belief. Then the guards moved her group forward, through the docking bridge, into the station's receiving area. I watched her go. That small figure in a gray shift marked with a red skull, walking toward transformation or death with more dignity than most soldiers carried into battle. The offloading continued for 18 hours. Group after group, level after level. Thousands of penitents transferred from ship to station with bureaucratic precision. I stood witness to much of it, moving between levels as Sister Octavia permitted, offering final blessings and words of comfort to those who sought them. Many did. Even those who had never attended my prayer sessions recognized the confessor's vestments and called out as they passed, asking for benedictions or simply acknowledgement that their suffering mattered. Goran passed in a middle group, still carrying himself with military bearing despite months of confinement. He did not call out, but he met my eyes and offered the smallest of nods. Soldier to soldier, human to human. One last acknowledgement before he walked into whatever future the administratum deemed appropriate for a former guardsman with minor precognitive abilities. The lower-level transfers were different. These penitents were sedated or restrained, loaded onto grav sleds like cargo, rather than escorted as people. Seraphine passed while unconscious, her face peaceful in ways it never had been during our brief confession. The woman who had killed her family to spare them from the warp would wake on Luna, be evaluated, and likely be consumed as fuel for the Astronomicon. Her visions of the future would end, and whatever entity had shown her those horrors would lose one more potential doorway into material reality. When the final group had been transferred, when the holds that had housed thousands were empty, except for the stains and smells that no amount of cleaning could fully remove, Captain Horvath made his final announcement of the voyage. All cargo successfully transferred to administratum custody. 0 breaches during offloading. The Misericordia Ultima has completed her duty to the Emperor and the Imperium. Crew is authorized for shore leave as previously outlined. We depart for the next collection cycle in 1 standard week. I was summoned to the captain's quarters that evening. He sat behind his desk, my service reports displayed on screens surrounding him. My entire 4-month tenure aboard his vessel reduced to data and assessments. Father Kael, he began, your ministry aboard this vessel has been complicated. You began with traditional confession, encountered significant psychic phenomena, adapted your approach, and completed the voyage without corruption or compromise. Astropath Valen's final evaluation indicates your psychic marks have stabilized and begun to fade. You are deemed suitable for continued service. He leaned forward slightly. I am authorized to offer you permanent assignment to Black Ship service. You would rotate between vessels, providing spiritual ministry to cargo during transport. Very few confessors survive even 1 voyage, and fewer still adapt as successfully as you have. Your experience would be valuable. I considered the offer. 4 more months of this. 4 more months per voyage. Multiple voyages per year. Decades of service aboard vessels carrying cursed souls to Terra. Watching thousands of penitents march towards soul binding or death. Offering comfort that could never truly address the horror they faced. Carrying the weight of their suffering while maintaining enough distance to avoid being consumed by it. I respectfully decline, Captain, I said. My experience has taught me that I am not suited for this particular form of ministry, but I request assignment to Terra itself, to minister to those who survive the processing, the sanctioned psychers, the astropathic choir, those who have been through soul binding and must live with what they have become. They require spiritual guidance as much as the cargo does, perhaps more. Horvath's expression shifted to something approaching approval. That posting is available and rarely requested. Most confessors cannot bear to witness what soul binding creates. But if you believe you can serve in that capacity, I will recommend your assignment to the Cathedral of the Astropathic Choir. I do, Captain. Thank you. He stood, extending his hand in a gesture that surprised me. I took it, and we shook once, firmly. You are a better man than you believe yourself to be, Father Kael. The entity that marked you was correct about your pride, but wrong about your capacity for growth. You learned. That is more rare than you know. I departed the Misericordia Ultima the following morning, carrying my single trunk of possessions down the docking bridge to Luna Station 7. Sister Octavia escorted me to the station's Administratum Processing Center, where I would receive temporary credentials and transport authorization to Terra proper. At the processing center entrance, she stopped and typed a final message on her data slate. "You will serve well. The silent witness, what words cannot heal." I bowed to her. The gesture of respect one offers to someone who has saved your life, even if neither party will acknowledge it directly. She returned the bow fractionally, then turned and walked back toward the ship, her null presence fading as she increased the distance between us. I was assigned quarters in the Cathedral of the Astropathic Choir 3 days later. I have been on Terra for 5 years now. I minister to the Astropathic Choir, to sanctioned psychers, to those who survived what breaks most humans. They still confess to me, but I no longer offer absolution. I cannot. I am not certain the Emperor hears prayers from the faithful. I am even less certain he hears confessions. What I do know is this: confession on a black ship is not a spiritual act. It is a beacon, a vulnerability that draws attention from the warp. Every word spoken feeds something that hungers. Every sin revealed strengthens the connection between confessor and the dark. They were right to warn me. Some confessions should never be heard, but someone must witness the suffering, even if they cannot end it, even if it slowly destroys them in turn. This is the real cost of faith in the Imperium. Not martyrdom or glory, but the slow erosion of certainty. One confession at a time, until all that remains is the duty to listen and the weight of every word you have heard.